Okay, so remember Pearl Harbor. Turns out it might have a thing or two to teach us about preventing a whole different kind of disaster. We're talking financial this time.
Oh, this is interesting.
We're diving deep into a podcast from 2030 called Avoiding World War III by this guy, David Lipton.
2030, huh? So we're getting a glimpse into the future.
Yeah, and let me tell you, he doesn't sugarcoat things. Like, picture this. Chinese warships just chilling off the coast of Long Island.
Wow, that's not exactly the image that comes to mind when I think of Long Island. Kind of unsettling.
Right. That's Lipton's point, though. He's saying the U.S. could be in a really vulnerable spot by 2030, like seriously vulnerable if we keep messing up our finances.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going.
Yeah.
So essentially, he's arguing that by 2030, the U.S. is so deep in debt, it can't really project its power globally anymore. Like, we're basically inviting other countries to test us.
Exactly. He actually makes this direct comparison to Pearl Harbor, saying we got to learn from that to prevent future crises. But instead of military stuff, he's talking about neglecting our economic health.
So the parallel is that unpreparedness, in this case financial unpreparedness, could lead to some pretty serious consequences.
Right. And remember, he's speaking from a 2030 perspective, so it's not theoretical for him. He's seen how this plays out.
Okay, so that begs the question. What does he think we should be doing about it? What's the solution?
Well, he's got this idea he calls reverse bond drives.
Reverse bond drive. So like the opposite of those war bonds.
Exactly.
But war bonds were about people lending money to the government, right?
Yeah.
This reverse bond drive sounds more like giving money back.
Well, he's suggesting that all Americans would contribute 10% of any government benefits they get, like Social Security, unemployment, that sort of thing.
So like if you get $1,000 a month from Social Security, you kick back 100.
Yeah, something like that. It could be direct payments or through tax credits. He's not super clear on the mechanics.
And he wants to apply the same logic to organizations, specifically 501c nonprofits. He proposes they pay at least 10% tax on whatever revenue they bring in.
Hold on, that's a big deal. They're tax exempt now, right? Wouldn't that totally change how the whole nonprofit sector works?
Yeah, he frames it as voluntary for individuals, like appealing to that whole patriotism thing.
Right.
But for organizations, he's pretty adamant that it would be mandatory.
I bet that would ruffle some feathers. There's got to be some serious potential downsides there.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's a trade-off for sure.
So where's all this money going? Lipton's not suggesting we just throw it into some giant government slush fund, right?
Nope. He proposes setting up a national debt sinking fund specifically designed to tackle the debt head-on.
Okay.
And his goal is pretty ambitious. Reduce the national debt by 4% every single year.
That's a big number. How much money are we talking about here?
He throws out this target of $2.4 trillion annually.
Whoa, 2.4 trillion. Can you even wrap your head around that?
Honestly, it's hard to grasp. But to put it in perspective, the total federal tax revenue in 2023 was somewhere around $4.9 trillion.
So basically, he's talking about almost half of the government's current income going straight towards debt reduction.
Yeah, it's a huge shift in how we'd be funding things.
And I imagine it wouldn't be spread out evenly. Lower income folks who rely on government assistance would probably feel this a lot more, right?
Yeah, you're hitting on a key point. That 10% contribution would definitely hit some people harder than others.
This reverse bond drive is already sparking a lot of questions, and we're just getting started. We'll unpack all this and more right after the break, so stick around.
It's interesting how Lipton connects this whole reverse bond drive thing back to those war bond drives during World War II.
Oh, yeah, you mean those campaigns where people bought bonds to support the war? My grandma used to tell me stories about them.
Exactly. It was seen as this patriotic duty, a way for everyone to pitch in.
Right.
And they were crazy successful. Lipton's trying to tap into that same kind of vibe, that sense of shared sacrifice.
But this time it's giving money back instead of lending it. It's kind of weird when you think about it. Did those war bonds actually make a difference back then?
They did. They helped pay for the war and kept inflation in check.
Huh.
Lipton argues that we need that same unity now to deal with our debt.
Okay, but let's be real for a sec. Do you really think people would be willing to make those kinds of sacrifices today?
Wow.
Especially with everything so divided politically?
That's a good point. Lipton does admit that it would require a big shift in how people think, both regular folks and the government.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine everyone suddenly getting on board with something like this.
He keeps talking about needing determination and political leadership, which, feels a little lacking these days.
It makes you wonder what American politics even looks like in Lipton's 2030. Did some amazing leader come along and bring everyone together?
Who knows? He doesn't really get into the specifics of the politics.
Right.
But it seems like it'd take a ton of cooperation, the kind we just don't see right now.
Yeah, that's for sure. It's kind of spooky thinking about how this all might play out.
It's like a message from the future telling us to get our act together.
Totally. But let's get back to this reverse bond drive for a minute. Even if we ignore the politics, is it even doable?
Oh,
Asking people to cough up 10% of their benefits, taxing nonprofits, that all sounds super disruptive.
it's a bold idea, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And it brings up a lot of practical questions, like, is it realistic to think people would voluntarily contribute that much?
Especially with the way the economy is right now. Inflation, wages, all that.
Right, it'd be a tough sell. And then there's the whole nonprofit thing. Taxing them could really mess things up.
Yeah.
They do so much important work.
Exactly. What happens if they can't afford to provide those services anymore?
Exactly. Lipton's proposal is interesting, but we got to be a little skeptical too.
Right.
We need to think about all the possible consequences.
Okay, so we've talked about the downsides, but Lipton's speaking from a 2030 where things have clearly gone wrong. Is he saying this reverse bond drive is the only way to fix things?
That's a really important question. I think it's important to remember that he's giving us one perspective, one possible solution.
So he's trying to get us to think differently about the problem.
Yeah, exactly. He wants us to wake up and see how big this issue really is.
So even if we don't love his specific plan, we can still learn from his way of thinking.
Absolutely. It's about being open to new ideas and challenging the status quo.
So maybe the reverse bond drive isn't the answer, but
Yeah.
it makes us ask, what are we willing to do?
Exactly. What are we willing to do to build a better future?
It's a call to action, for sure. We need to get creative and find solutions.
And we need to have a serious conversation as a nation about our priorities.
Because what we do today will determine what happens tomorrow.
That's what it all comes down to, yeah. What can you, the listener, do with this information?
Well, first things first, don't just take our word for it.
Right.
Go check out Lipton's podcast yourself and see what you think.
Yeah.
Then talk to your friends, your family, your elected officials, whoever. Let's get this conversation going.
It all starts with awareness.
And who knows, maybe by 2030 we'll be looking back and laughing about that whole Chinese warships thing.
Fingers crossed.
Let's dive into some other perspectives on this fiscal responsibility thing. Stay with us.
Okay, so we've spent a good chunk of time on Lipton's reverse bond drive and all that. But I got to ask, what if I'm not quite ready to hand over 10% of my, benefits just yet? Are there other ways to approach this whole fiscal responsibility thing?
Well, Lipton's giving us a warning from the future,
Right.
but it's not the only way to think about it.
Right.
Remember, he's looking back from 2030. Things might be a mess for him, but we're in 2024. We still have time to, adjust course.
So what are some of those other options? What are people talking about now that could help us avoid, the whole warships off Long Island scenario?
Well, a lot of folks are focusing on entitlement programs.
Yeah, those big ones. Social Security, Medicare, all those. They're already a huge part of government spending, and it's only going to get bigger as the population ages.
Right, the aging population, that's always a hot topic. But reforming those programs, that's like political suicide. Nobody wants to touch that.
It's definitely controversial, but honestly, they're not sustainable the way they're set up now. We got to figure out how to make them work for the long term, or we're going to be forced to make some really drastic cuts down the road.
So what are we talking about here? Raising the retirement age, making benefits dependent on how much money you have.
There are a bunch of ideas floating around. Some are more extreme than others. Like some people want to gradually raise the retirement age since people are living longer these days. Others think we should base benefits on how much money you make, so wealthier retirees would get less.
I guess that makes sense, but wouldn't those changes end up hurting lower income folks the most? The ones who really rely on those programs?
That's a huge concern for sure. Any changes we make have to be fair to everyone, especially those who are already struggling.
So it's a tricky situation, lots of tough choices to make.
Yeah, no easy answers. But the important thing is that we start having these conversations now before it's too late.
Right. So entitlement reform is one piece of the puzzle. What else is there?
Tax reform is another biggie. Our tax code is, well, a mess.
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
It's super complicated and full of loopholes. If we could simplify it and close those loopholes, we could bring in a lot more revenue.
Wait, so you're saying we should raise taxes. That's another thing politicians hate to talk about.
Not necessarily raise taxes across the board. It's more about making the system fairer and more efficient. Like closing loopholes that benefit the super rich and big corporations that could even things out and generate more revenue without, like, crushing the middle class.
Okay, I see what you're saying. But wouldn't those with the most to lose fight tooth and nail against any kind of tax reform? I mean, lobbyists, campaign donations, all that.
Yeah, for sure. There would definitely be pushback from powerful interests, but that's where regular people like us come in.
You mean by speaking up and making our voices heard?
Exactly. We can't just sit around and expect politicians to fix everything. We got to stay informed, get involved, and hold our leaders accountable. We have to make it clear that fiscal responsibility is a priority for us, even if it means they got to make some unpopular decisions.
So you're saying we need to be more proactive, more involved in how our government works?
Yeah, kind of. Democracy only works when we all participate. If we want a government that's looking out for the long-term good of the country, we got to let them know.
So bottom line, what can our listeners do right now to make a difference?
Well, first things first, educate yourselves.
Yeah.
Learn about the issues, the different arguments, all that. Don't just take what you hear at face value.
Yeah, do your homework. It's actually pretty interesting once you get into it.
Exactly. And once you've got a good understanding of things, get involved. Talk to your friends and family, contact your elected officials, support organizations that are working on these issues. Every little bit counts.
So it's not enough to just understand the problem. We got to be part of the solution. We all have a responsibility to help shape the future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And, even though the challenges are big, they're not impossible to overcome. We can do this, but we got to work together.
Lipton, speaking from 2030, reminds us of that, right? His message is kind of bleak, but he ends on that hopeful note. Yes, we can.
Exactly. We can. But it all starts with each of us.
Well, there you have it, folks. A deep dive into the world of fiscal responsibility, warnings from the future, radical ideas, and a call to action for all of us.
It's a complicated issue, but one we can't afford to ignore. Our choices today will determine what tomorrow looks like, not just for us, but for the whole world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.